Yeah.
Yes, Ebru Hocam, we're ready.
Excellent. So we're getting very excited, actually. I mean, I personally am very excited to be here. So I think all the audience is out there waiting for us to start. Okay. Well, hello, everyone. Good afternoon or good morning. I don't know where everybody is attending this webinar today. This is our Politics and Society webinars. Well, it used to be the Politics and Society seminars. So for some time, unfortunately, we are all meeting online, but the good side of these online meetings is I think we can meet with people, experts from different parts of the world. And we are in one of those meetings where we have distinguished panelists from different parts of Europe. And I want to thank Hande Hoca for bringing us all together. Well, I'm not I'm not an environment and politics person. Well, but this is all done by Hande. So again, Hande, thank you very much. It's been like for some time that I was putting too much pressure on Hande. So why don't we organize something on climate change? It's it's important. We have to learn. Create awareness, things, and so forth and so on. So finally, we are here, and we'll be talking and hearing about the climate crisis as a political issue. Well, of course, it has like various aspects, and it has been like systematically studied and discussed on the political scene like since the early 1960s. And thanks to all these efforts of the United Nations or international non-governmental organizations, civil society, of course, academics. And of course, it has, as I told you, it has like various aspects for us to study climate change. But we will be covering the political aspect of the issue. And well, I'm studying security, and I've been telling and teaching a lot about the security aspect of climate change. And we start with raising this question as like if climate change is a security threat, or if we are threatening climate as individuals, human beings. So that's why just a political science perspective on climate change itself also has various question marks. So again, I'm not going to go into all these details, of course, of the emergence of the issue. We will hear brilliant presentations from our panelists today. But let me briefly tell you and introduce our panelists and leave the word to them. We have three panelists today that will be talking about different aspects of climate crisis. First, we have Ethemcan Turhan. Ethemcan, welcome, and thank you again for being us here. Ethemcan Turhan is an assistant professor of environmental planning at the Faculty of Spatial Sciences at University of Groningen. And he has been a postdoctoral researcher at the Royal Institute of Technology Environmental Humanities Laboratory in Stockholm for some time. And then he received his PhD at University of Barcelona. And he has actually a great record of publications on this issue. One of his recent studies is a co-edited book on transforming social natures in Turkey, landscape states and environmental movements, if I'm not mistaken. And Ethemcan will be talking about old tactics and new challenges. This is his presentation, and rethinking climate movement for uncertain times. Then we have David Williams, who's been a Mercator IPC Fellow and Helmholtz-Zentrum, Gestacht, yes, if I'm not, wrong. David studied geography in Manchester and Hamburg, and then submitted his PhD in political science on enhancing the adaptive capacity of vulnerable communities to respond to climate change. And he has published academic as well as non-academic literature on climate change adaptation, climate injustice, and he'll be talking about on covering the local level challenges of the climate change. And We also have Hande Paker. Well, it's a great pleasure, Hande, for us to hear you also. Well, we all know Hande Paker, but let me also briefly introduce my colleague, my friend. She's a political sociologist who works on civil society, state, cosmopolitan citizenship, and political ecology. And she's carried out, a great number of research and published, on these topics, as well as the environmental struggles. She holds a PhD from McGill University, and she also is a Mercator IPC fellow, and she was for a while a visiting fellow at Hamburg University. And she's based, of course, at our faculty, at our department. And Hande will be talking about framing speech and, the climate crisis as a political matter. Well, thank you very much again. We'll start with Hande, and then we'll continue with Ethemcan and David. Well, I would like to thank again Hande for bringing us all together here. And please enjoy the panel all. You'll have like 15 to 20 minutes each to talk. Thank you very much. Yes, Hande, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Ebru Hocam, and thank you for the introductions as well. And I would also like to welcome everybody, especially our panelists today who have so kindly agreed to join us. I will start by wishing you all a very pleasant afternoon. And Ebru said that she's not an environment and politics person, but by the end of the panel, we're hoping to make all political science an environment and politics person. So that's the secret agenda. In the following presentation, I will introduce some questions that I think are crucial and hope to start a conversation rather than provide set answers. So my aim is to bring together a framework which is by no means consolidated, but maybe improved upon by discussion here. It would not be amiss to start this talk by pointing out the state of the Earth under climate change, remind you of the almost never-ending wildfires this year, the records in temperature rise broken again just this year, as well as record high temperatures in the coldest areas of the Earth, like the Arctic, the ensuing meltdown, the frequency of extreme weather events, such as the highest number of hurricanes recorded this year, droughts, floods. This is the grim situation, and the human impact on the Earth has reached such a scale that we now have to talk about crisis. However, the talk is oriented towards discussing the best responses to the crisis, and that is shaped by the political. I'm sorry, I'm just going to share a simple presentation so that you don't have to look at me all the time. All right. So 50 years into the emergence of the modern environmental movement, 48 years into the publication of Limits to Growth, which quite accurately predicted the state of affairs we find ourselves in at the moment, if we had not paid attention to limits, which we did not. 48 years after the first global UN conference on the environment, why is it that we still have to look for ways of turning around the ecological crisis? Because it feels like this should have already happened. Now, the fact is the ecological crisis has gone from bad to worse. So I think it's worthwhile to ponder on the question, what does this have to do with how politics is designed? Okay. The global policymaking framework of UNFCCC, which is right now informed by the current Paris Agreement, which is the framework agreement for mitigating climate change and adapting to climate change. And this is signed by 197 countries, so most countries in the world basically, except for a few, among which is Turkey. So it is an agreement which enjoys a high level of legitimacy. This framework, though, is characterized by a number of points that I want to underline. One is economic growth fetishism, which is an unproblematized prioritization of economic growth at all costs. This is the idea that both economic growth and environmental protection are possible simultaneously. This is accompanied by a technology optimism, the faith that new technologies and innovations will solve our problems. So this frames climate change as mainly a technological problem. This is not to say that, of course, technology will not be necessary in mitigation and adaptation, but as I hope to show you, the problem is defining the problem as, or mostly in technical terms. It is also characterized by a short-termism, and this is the feeling that there's very little time left, and there is very little time left. IPCC has given us a 12-year window in which climate change mitigation and adaptation can happen, and the temperature rise can be limited to 2 degrees without tipping points kicking in. And that was 2 years ago, so it's already now shorter. This urgency is reflected in the motto, listen to the science. Okay, an approach that understandably wants to prioritize science, especially given the damage populist politics has done through reviving climate denialism and exacerbating polarization, which again leads to inaction. There are 2 problems here. One, this approach takes politics only as partisanship in the conventional sense of party politics. And we find a similar definition in parts of civil society, including parts of the climate movements, which leads to the claim by some civil society actors that they are above politics or beyond politics. The second problem is that no matter how conclusive the science is, and it is conclusive, it is still filtered through inequalities and divergent political affiliations. Without engaging them, science does not necessarily and always translate into climate action. So all of this leads to depoliticization, which is an emerging debate. About 15 years ago, Tony Blair said, global warming is too serious for the world any longer to ignore its danger or split into opposing factions on it. And I think this is a nice short quote which illustrates depoliticization. And let me try to open that concept a little bit. Now, environmental discourses, policies, and advocacy become depoliticized to the extent that they gloss over the inherent conflict between sustainability and current forms of economic growth and production and consumption, obviously. Those who emphasize technocratic and market-oriented approaches gloss over the inherent trade-offs involved in fending off the ecological crisis, relying on a sort of unfounded optimism that limitless growth and sustainability can be reconcile. Green economy discourse of reconciling people, planet, profit is also depoliticizing in this sense, because it rejects the difficult trade-offs and associated conflicts. And depoliticized approaches fail to acknowledge planetary limits, limits that were underlined, as I said, 48 years ago. And this shift is conceptualized as the post-ecologist turn, defining an era in which the environmental crisis is taken very seriously, while simultaneously and paradoxically, existing social structures and practices that cause the crisis are reproduced. Second, depoliticization blurs hegemonic power relations, so it doesn't really look at power relations, and conflicting positions of actors. Consensus seeking, as illustrated in the code, renders invisible those responsible for bringing about climate change, and the inequalities in relation to who suffers what kind of impact. This is exactly what climate justice calls for, making explicit those who are responsible for climate change, as well as the vulnerabilities in being exposed to it. Moreover, it also glosses over contestations over the best response, imposing technological and market-based solutions. For instance, when ecological modernization or green economy discourses become hegemonic, criticism of marketization of nature, for instance, through emission trading schemes, can become excluded. Depoliticization of climate change ties in with a broader debate about politics, about how consensual policy making has increasingly pervaded spaces of democratic participation, to the extent that it eliminates dispute and conflict from the public sphere. This is defined as post-political, and it has been argued that the consolidation of this post-political condition is similar to the process of construction of a consensus on the perceived inevitability of the market economy, and to act as if there's no alternative to it, and relying on tools and mechanisms it generates to resolve global problems that climate change unloads onto us. The problem is not that climate change is framed as a common concern. There's much to be said, again, from a politicized perspective for this, but that it's done in a way that admits no contestation or dissent. The link between democracy and socio-ecological transformation is being explored again by asking the question, political question, of how democracy needs to be transformed in order to overcome the impasse of the environmental state, to the extent that this environmental state exists, and bring about a more effective ecological transformation. This impasse has been identified as the post-ecologist condition, which is associated with a contradiction. Rather than reversing the ecological crisis, participation practices and democratic values, to the extent that they exist, given in the current state of democracies, they become instrumental in not reversing the crisis necessarily, but in sort of managing the existing unsustainability. So that's why politics needs to be we need to refocus on the political process. And it needs to be redesigned by focusing on it, not as a partisan politics, but as an open process of decision-making on a common problem that concerns all, but that doesn't affect all in the same way. Excuse me. And closely related to this is, of course, the question of who has a seat at the table. So there is a common problem, but there are inequalities, cleavages, differences in relation to causes and remedies. This is what climate justice argues and demands. However, rather than acknowledging these inequalities and cleavages, global politics of climate change has become depoliticized. And the calls to take action are about repoliticizing it by underlining climate justice and intersectionalities. So the demands from civil society for mitigation and adaptation are simultaneously political demands that call for democratic participation and climate justice. And further, they are shaped by intersectionalities. The demands for an alternative politics entail demands for change toward more racial and gender equality, for instance. So once these inequalities are taken into account, common solutions, a common ground can be co-designed more effectively. And this, of course, is in turn shaped by the political context in which civil society actors and citizens address states. So the impasse created at the level of national politics and global policy making may be overcome by alternative paths offered by local governments, for instance, and climate movements. So looking at different scales of politics, such as cities or non-institutionalized actors, such as movements, and the local transnational ties between them. So the next speakers will actually explore both these levels through the lens of climate justice. So I'm going to stop here and turn the floor over to Ethemcan.
Thank you very much, Hande. That was a great framing of the issue, like how the emergency of climate change, climate crisis from a political perspective. Well, of course, it has like a dramatic security aspect, like, you know, the frame that you presented from depoliticization of the issue to the politicization of the issue involves the security scholars in a similar way. So making climate crisis as a security issue, you know, is maybe what we need to raise awareness at the political decision-making level. So I want to pass to Ethemcan. Ethemcan will be talking more about the challenges. So Ethemcan, please, the floor is yours, and we're looking forward to hearing you.
Thank you, Ebru Hocam, for this very nice introduction. And thank you, Hande, for putting this great panel together. I'm extremely pleased to be able to join you today. First of all, let me try to share my screen. I learned that Zoom has some new tricks, so it should help me to do it now. And whoop, yes. Okay, maybe to start with one of the last points that Ebru Hoca raised about the securitization of climate matters, since this is a kindly like to object to the fact that we need more securitization of climate change. I would rather argue that we need a desecuritization of climate change and maybe focus more on the human security dimensions, or maybe scrap the security language altogether because it calls for particular actors. But today, what I would like to talk about is basically to kind of rethink the climate movement, the global climate justice movement together for uncertain times. And in doing so, I would like to start with the recent book of Ian Schoenis and Andy Sterling, which is titled The Politics of Uncertainty, Challenges of Transformation, which I will draw on quite a bit today, in which they argue that embracing uncertainties, and here I quote, as constructions of knowledge, materiality, experience, embodiment, and practice means challenging singular notions of modernity and progress as hardwired one-track race to the future. And Schoenis and Sterling further add that ideas of development and sustainability are very often associated with a linear perspective on progress, dominated by narrow views of natural science and economics, natural sciences and economics often, which obscures and smokescreens the potential alternatives, radical futures, and different societal pathways. So in my contribution today, what I will try to do is to take a quick stock of the past tactics of the global climate justice movement and try to think through these for a post-pandemic world for radically different futures, or maybe better put, a world that needs to embrace accelerating uncertainties. But I would like to start off by acknowledging the tireless work and resistance of those activists today in places like Ünye, Salihli, Tokat Erbaa, Ida Mountains, Kaz Dağları, Northern Forests of Istanbul, and all across the Anatolian territory who fight for their local livelihoods. And this acknowledgement, I believe, is even more important in a time when almost 1,800 environmental and land defenders are killed globally in the past 15 years. So these killings are most frequently associated with agro-industrial, mining projects, energy projects, and their determinants include, among others, income levels. So poor people tend to be killed more. Foreign direct investment, so where you have more foreign capital entering, you have trouble. Where you have mineral dependence of a country's economy, you have trouble. And the regime type, particularly in a time we talk a lot about authoritarian regimes. And this is something I picked from the work of Philippe Lebillon and Pavi Luhala's recent analyses. So this actually takes me back to the original formulation of the Funtovitz and Ravets in terms of the timeliness of a post-normal science. And when they refer to post-normal science, Funtovitz and Ravets say that this is timely when acts are uncertain, values in dispute, stakes high, and decisions urgent. I would argue that this couldn't be more true for the global climate justice movements at this historical junction. And first, I would like to start with talking a bit about the coming of age of the global climate justice movement in terms of moving beyond the inside-outside debate. So in the past 2 decades, the global climate justice movement have seen many ups and downs in critical instances. Meanwhile, it's grew in numbers and reach. So today, a lot more people talk about something like climate justice, global climate justice in different formulations. But some of these historical highlights and transformations in the global climate justice debate were in relation with the institutional processes such as COP15 in 2009 in Copenhagen, or COP21, Conference of the Parties, 21st Conference of the Parties in 2015 in Paris, which is basically a platform on which you have tens of thousands of people embarking in a big conference center, including those government representatives, NGO representatives, and also people who preach climate justice. And what do? Well, basically they negotiate a lot and they organize lots of events, side events, and so on and so forth. And then at the end of the day, the governments basically set up rules on which they promise that they will deliver and end up not delivering. And for this, incredible amounts of money is spent on complete, I would say, nonsense side events, which is more about nationalist and corporate show-off than any meaningful climate action, I would say. So for the climate movement, which has dedicated a considerable amount of energy and effort to negotiation tracking. This is nice and useful, but not enough. There seems to be a need to trespass into an uncharted territory of activism where feel-good actions are not enough anymore. And I think it's good to remember that the emergence of global climate justice movement in the world stage was through its convergence with the global anti or alter globalization movement in early 2000s. So basically, the shift is explained as the convergence of a cause without a global movement, that's climate justice, to a movement without a cause, when the global justice movement actually all of a sudden found itself without a cause. And so when Joan Martinez, Alier, and others ask, is there a global environmental justice movement, or is there a global climate justice movement? I would say the answer is a yes, but a rather more nuanced one. I think what we have been witnessing over the past few years is also the emergence of new solid actors, such as youth groups, Black and people of color communities leading the way, which is extremely important, which is extremely useful. But again, the usual risk is over there, to have a very settler colonialist centric, Western centric approach to climate action by outsourcing the justice struggle to the marginalized communities. And the antidote, as many critical scholars and climate justice movements argue, and I would agree with them, is an abolitionist approach to climate justice. An abolitionist approach to climate justice that would focus on reparation ecologies, as James Moore puts it, would mean that climate justice cannot be separated from other historical injustices affecting our world. So abolitionist climate justice, in the formulation of Malini Ranganathan and Eve Bratman, centers history, intersectional experiences, and forms of care, healing, and solidarity already practiced by grassroots groups, rather than imposing international expert-led plans from outside. So for instance, this also resonates with what Salena Tremel calls as convergence as a political strategy that brings together issues and movements, class and identity, scales and frameworks, space and territory, and also ideology and governance. However, it may be good to also see some of the shortcomings of the movements, including cooptation of the very term climate justice. Although originally defined as a social and political demand that advocates for the redistribution of power, knowledge, and well-being, the meaning of climate justice is increasingly being hollowed out by different actors. So here we are, 5 years on from 12th of December 2015, when the bell rang by former Foreign Minister of Foreign Affairs of France, Laurent Fabius, and the Paris Agreement was declared to the world. What has changed? So where are we now? So achieving the overall goals of Paris Agreement, we are told, will require a deep reduction in global greenhouse gas emissions, ideally by around 50% by 2030 and complete phase out by 2050. However, we know that the current national pledges, not the current national policies, these are just the pledges still, are insufficient to achieve the overall Paris goals. And that would only lead to 17% of reduction if everything is implemented by 2030. So I think it's important to look at what the climate justice groups demand and advocate for at this moment. A recent initiative by grassroots groups and global justice networks introduced what they call Glasgow Agreement in the name of the city that will host COP next year, which is an agreement that provides room for some hope. The purpose of this agreement is to reclaim the initiative from governments and international institutions by creating an alternative tool for action and a space for strategy and coordination for the global climate justice movement. And this Glasgow Agreement suggests that climate justice movement so far had a very big focus on pressuring governments to take action on climate change or to push for stronger international agreements within the framework of UNFCCC, such as Kyoto Protocol back in '97 or Paris Agreement in 2015. But meanwhile, the emissions continued to increase. And hence, they argue, Glasgow Agreement proposes that civil society, global climate justice groups, proposes its own plan of action, no longer waiting for the governments and international institutions to do so. And basically, the argument here is to try to catch up with the 1.5 degrees target, which seems to be impossible to be achieved with the governmental action. And an important issue here also is that weak commitments under the existing institutional arrangements, such as the now long gone Kyoto Protocol or the Paris Agreement, have not produced meaningful reduction in the global scale to halt the worst impacts of climate change. So basically, these type of institutional arrangements stayed mainly as a procedure, not even being able to achieve their own stated goals, therefore not preventing the worst consequences of climate change. So what these groups suggest is a two-pronged approach. One is a political and economic non-cooperation, including civil disobedience in different levels, and two, climate justice as the key political framework for action, incorporating interdependence between all species, hence multi-species justice, structural racism, the need to shift towards an economy of care that puts life at the center, the need for just transition for workers, a focus on indigenous and local knowledge, need for reparations for communities and peoples at the front lines of climate injustice, and a rejection of green capitalism. So climate chaos in this formulation actually intersects with the top issues of our time, from immigration to public health to migration flows to global economic restructuring. And of course, all of these interactions come with significant implications for each other. I would say that one of the emerging fields of struggle here is to reclaim the power from the state, not only from the state, but also sub-state actors, namely at the municipal level, but also reaching out and working in, against, and beyond the state. I think one of the most clear aspects of this shift of reclaiming power is also a clear stance against the carbon arithmetics, or carbon metrics, as some like to call it, which basically refer to abstractions in terms of speaking about climate change in terms of calories, kilos, meters, tons of CO2 equivalent, which seem to be objective and reliable in expert lingo. And also the calls to do the math of climate, which may not necessarily find its target unless these calls are combined with clear radical political alternatives. So the states, the state actors, and the international climate regime have no problem with getting the numbers right. I mean, I wouldn't think that they don't know the numbers. I would say that they do know their numbers very well. Thinking the other way would be to fool ourselves, actually. They've got the right numbers, but the wrong prescription. So one important initiative, for instance here, was the fossil fuel divestment movement, which has been on the agenda for some time. But from recent studies in econometrics, we know that divestment movement have rather been unsuccessful in damaging the fossil fuel interests, although it has been successful in questioning their social license to operate. But when it comes to playing the game of the mainstream, divestment movement has not been particularly successful. Yet the fight is not over, I would say, because zombies and monsters always come back in one format or another to haunt utopias. And I think this is very much true for climate justice movement as well. So for instance, let's take the term net zero that's used by the world's biggest polluters and governments as a smokescreen to evade responsibility. To kind of net zero emissions do not mean zero emissions. So net zero emissions do not mean zero emissions and should not be accepted at face value. G20 communique, which referred to circular carbon economy. So just look at the recent G20 final declaration of leaders, which refers to the circular carbon economy. I mean, what does that mean, basically? It basically means that the business as usual will be rebranded as a circular economy. And basically we know that there is not simply enough available land on the planet to accommodate all the combined corporate and government net zero plans, either through offsets or through carbon capture and storage, or mass renewable uptake in different constellations. So when we speak about Green New Deals in different forms and constellations, I think it's important to kind of remind ourselves that this renewable transition will not go unchallenged. I mean, this will be challenged. So collectively, net zero climate targets actually allow for the emitters to continue emitting their greenhouse gases, while hoping that particular technologies or particular false solutions, as climate justice movement puts it, will suck carbon dioxide out of air. So I think it's important at this moment to see that what climate justice movements are doing is an uphill battle, actually. So they're waging an uphill battle. And it's important to underline that the unilateral pledges of China to reach peak carbon before 2030 or drive down emissions to virtually zero by 2060 will also include particular authoritarian measures. So how does climate justice movements respond to this from bottom up? Particularly in a time when we see that authoritarian neoliberalism and xenophobic populism is holding its grip tight on the world. I mean, how do you respond to that? So the second and a less elaborate issue is about the pandemic, because we know from Neil Smith, the late geographer Neil Smith, that there's no such thing as a natural disaster. And the worst, so what we have seen with the pandemic is that the pandemic has actually exposed the fragility of our social institutions, and COVID-19 actually reshaped almost every aspect of our daily life. However, a bigger threat is on the horizon. It's not even on the horizon, it's here and now, the climate crisis. And it actually prompts us to kind of re-question our tactics and strategies. So from the pandemic response, we know that greenhouse gas emissions will probably go down by 8% this year. And for instance, in the month of April, when compared with last year, a recent research published in Nature Climate Change showed us that the daily CO2 emissions went down by almost 20%, the biggest fall since the Second World War. And this included reductions in key sectors such as energy, but also transportation, aviation, and industry. A drop of this size is important, but the question is, will we be able to keep it that way? Well, research shows us that it will be very difficult to keep it that way, since there will most likely be a rebound. And then the uncertainty is looming again, whether the new normal will be worse than the old normal, and whether the climate justice movements will be able to move beyond the new normal to formulate and materialize a different future outside this dichotomy. So the COVID-19 pandemic is already exposing deep inequalities across class, gender, race, and economic status, and also points at the inadequacy of the state's social safety nets. So basically, climate justice movement needs to undergo, and is already undergoing, a fundamental shift in terms of how it understands and responds to climate crisis, including social policy at its heart. And third and the last point is about how do we envision a world after pandemic. So the book that I referred at the very beginning of my talk by Skunis and Sterling refer to the gravest form of oppression as the invisible foreclosing of potential futures. So it's important that the potential futures are made visible, and good activism and good research actually provides a venue for that. So it's important when we see new actors such as Fridays for Future and Extinction Rebellion and others coming up, but we also need to acknowledge their limitations and make sure that they avoid cooptation and taming in the hands of the global governance talk. So simply put, there is no magic wand. Racial, gender, economic justice, all colors of the global social justice movement need to come together in an intersectional setup. And this needs to include the agency of those who are most vulnerable and most marginalized. So for instance, take the case of seasonal agricultural workers or farm workers who continued harsh work under COVID-19 and climate impacts. These are some of the communities that has lowest political power, lowest economic power, yet they're essential workers for our food systems. So climate concerns, systemic racism, discrimination, xenophobia, inequities in healthcare and housing, food insecurity, global public health are not isolated problems. So basically solutions to these problems cannot be found in isolation either. So as a very last point, and I know that I'm way over time, but I would like to kind of point at the risk of eco-fascist ideologies taking over the climate justice movement, because eco-fascist ideologies are ever present and climate justice movements will need to deal with this fact too. So the message that Earth is healing, we are the virus mantra promotes this exclusionary view. It's dangerous to imply that humans are on the differences between different societal groups, and make sure that climate justice groups seek to reclaim the power at different scales. And returning to the arguments of Schooness and Sterling as the last sentence, I would say that the bottom line should be to open up a political space to confront radical uncertainty as a way to emancipatory politics. And it's important that we don't get stuck with assumptions of linear, stable systems amenable to technical risk management and control. So the new normal will not be the solution. And I would say that the hopeful politics of care and conviviality is probably the way. Thank you very much.
All right, thank you so much. That was, I think, an all-encompassing framework to tackle, you know, and to address the issues related to climate change, because we tend to think that it's like the natural scientists' issue to deal with climate change, but apparently in those very hard times that we're going through, you know, it seems that we forget, the international community seems to have forgotten the climate crisis. At least we don't hear very frequently about, you know, Greta effect. And we know that it is just like one of the most sustainable, unfortunately, in the pejorative way, sustainable crisis that we have to come up with leadership global at the global level and at the local level, right? And I think David will cover, you know, this dichotomy, the paradox, you know, finding a local solution to this global problem. Thank you very much, Ethemcan. And I just want to move on to David, who will be talking about the local responses. So yes, the floor is yours, David.
Thank you very much for the very kind introduction, and thank you very much for having me here today. It's a real pleasure to take part. And yes, as you said, I will be covering sort of how multi-level governance works as a response to climate change, but with a particular focus on the local level. So I've just shared my screen. I hope you can see it. Let's get started. After Ethemcan's criticism of sort of absolutist numbers from climate science, I thought I'd show an absolutist graph, sort of detailing where we're at right now. So you can see this is from 2017, we're sort of a couple of years after that. According to the World Meteorological Organization, we are currently at 1.3 degrees global warming compared to pre-industrial levels. Pre-industrial just because that's when we started emitting greenhouse gases into the atmosphere. So lots of people say, okay, why should I care about 1 degree or 1.5 degrees warming? I won't really notice, but the problem is that if you change the chemical composition in the atmosphere, then this has really wide-ranging changes. And that sort of explains my angle. So I come from geography and I did my PhD at a climate institute. So we were quite interested in what effects will this have on communities. Because as you can see, we are not going to manage to mitigate all the climate change effects, if any, hopefully. So we really need to talk about adaptation as well as an add-on to mitigation. And the way adaptation works at the moment is, I think you had the UNFCCC mentioned so far. So climate change is the classical example of a problem which cannot be solved by a single state. It has to be solved at the international governance level, because whatever happens in point A affects point B, because we're in a closed system. So legislation gets passed at the national level, but actually implementing this legislation is often carried by local governance institutions. And in theory, this is fine, this makes sense. It's just basically the recognition that, that responsibility is shared between different levels of governance, between international, national, regional, and local level of governance. But there's a bit of a problem, unfortunately, because it's not that simple. So we call it the Swiss cheese model of climate governance, which is that the regulations and laws and policies passed at the international level don't always make it to the local governance level. They have to pass through national, regional, local before they reach communities, and communities can actually feel the consequence of this implementation. And the problem is that all these different governance levels are completely different in different locations. There's no one size fits all to how you pass a regulation at the international level, and then that actually has an effect. At the local level, it's dependent on many different things. It's dependent on priorities, on agendas, on time lapses. And what's also really important, especially when we're talking about the local level, the implementing level, is vulnerability. Now, vulnerability is a concept, a big concept in climate change science, and it's composed of exposure. So how exposed are you to a climate extreme event in the form of a drought or a flood or a heat wave? How sensitive are you? So when these external hazards occur, what is the degree of damage that you experience in your community, in your locality? And adaptive capacity. Adaptive capacity is your ability to directly respond and to recover from climate hazards when they occur. And you can play around a bit with sort of indicators and indexes and come up with a global distribution of vulnerability. So this is a climate demography vulnerability index, and what this shows is where the most vulnerable people are located. And it's composed of those three elements that I just showed you. And so the first thing that I think, which is pretty visible, is that vulnerability to climate change impact is very unequally distributed. It's very different depending on where you are. And I think the second thing that you can see is anyone who sort of from the international development field can sort of see that vulnerability seems to be pretty linked to level of income. So the areas depicted in red are mainly those areas which are impoverished and have low access to external resources. This is, of course, in stark contrast to those countries who are responsible for CO2 emissions, particularly having a look at the cumulative rate. And I couldn't find a map detailing this. I don't know if anyone here is good on sort of mapping systems or GIS. This would be really useful. And also remember that this is cumulative CO2 emissions on an absolute level. This doesn't take into context how many people live in the country, so the per head production of CO2, and it also doesn't take into account where the products which are consumed causing CO2 emissions, which basically means sort of a country like China, which has a huge population and produces things mainly for the Western world and for North America, is often shown too high on these graphs. So yeah, as you can see, vulnerability is really different in different localities, and it's quite a new phenomenon because, as I showed on the first graph, this is only something that has really been sort of taking place the last 20 to 30 years, which caused this rather nice quote, I find, from the Ministry of Social Security, National Solidarity and then environment and sustainable development. I love the name of this ministry. I think we need more of them throughout different countries. This ministry made the statement that as the climate is changing, so is the operating environment for local authorities. The local authorities will need to be armed with appropriate proactive responses to the emerging climate threats. So this shows two things. First of all, is the recognition of the importance of the local level, because this is where the climate change impacts are felt, this is where they're experienced, and the closeness to local communities is at the local level, at the local governance level. And secondly, it also refers to adaptive capacity. There's a real issue with adaptive capacity in areas which are particularly affected by climate change. And one of those areas that I was lucky enough to work in is Mauritius. I was working with coastal communities in Mauritius, and the main problem they're having there, as a small island state in the middle of the Indian Ocean, is obviously sea level rise, but it's more complicated than that. So if you, so further impacts are in increasing temperature of the ocean and acidification, which are both climate change induced. And if you have a look at an aerial image of Mauritius, there's this perfect fluorescent ring around the island, which is a coral reef. And this protects the island from heavy waves. It breaks the waves far out and creates this very nutrient-rich lagoon, which is where fishermen live off. And this is being depleted, and it's also meaning that the waves are hitting the coast, causing coastal erosion and flooding. And this is a really big problem in small island states in general. And one of the problems they have is that they are quite tightly strung in terms of resources. They don't have many, they don't really have the option of having diversified economies. They don't have resources to fall back on, and also just in a physical sense, they don't have much space on the island to move to be safe, because it's just a very small island. So this is one example of a community who is disproportionately affected by climate change. And another example of a community that I've worked with is Quarry Road West, an informal settlement in Durban in South Africa, which is a city located on the coast. Coasts are particularly affected by climate change because the warming of the ocean means that there's an addition of water vapor to the atmosphere, which is enhancing the risk of storms, which is bringing with it heavy flooding. And this is compounding vulnerability by an on-land dynamic, which is twofold. First of all, you have rural-urban migration to cities mainly located on the coast. This is due to historical reasons for these cities being economic hubs, because that's where the ports are. And this rural-urban migration is being fueled by climate change, which is leading to the impoverishment of rural areas because it's having an effect on agriculture. And then the other one is population growth, which is just leading to the densification of cities where space is limited as it is, and it's forcing people to establish settlements in more and more vulnerable areas, because those are the areas where no one else wants to live. It's areas right on on steep hills, which is vulnerable to landslides, and it's close to rivers, which is vulnerable to flooding. And this is really a pattern which is happening all across the global south. This is a huge issue, not just in South Africa, but on the African continent, in South America, and in Southeast Asia as well. So let's come back to our multi-level governance scale. It doesn't seem to be working that well for these local communities, because at the moment it's very much a top-down approach. And what we're seeing is a move towards a more bottom-up approach. So it's involving communities into what are their priorities, what are their needs, how are they affected, and what can be done to help them, because it's so context-specific. I'm just going to briefly outline two ways that are currently being proposed to do this. One is called polycentric governance, so it's giving more authority to local governance systems through city-to-city learning approaches. These are just a number of organizations which can facilitate this and sort of act as a platform. You have C40 Cities and IKLE, of which Istanbul actually is both a member of. And then you have Cities Alliance and Shack Dwellers International, which sort of deal with impoverishment and climate change. And then you also have working towards a climate resilient future with a covenant of mayors. So these sort of cities can come together regardless of national boundaries and try and sort of learn from each other. And then the other thing that we have going is called urban adaptation justice. This is fourfold. So we have participation, okay? When we talk about decision-making and policy planning at the local level, local communities need to be participated, particularly those marginalized communities. Ethemcan already talked about how marginalization is often rooted in deep socio-historic contexts. You will often see these sort of intersections manifesting themselves in who is also marginalized from decisions related to climate change adaptation. So it's all about finding out who is vulnerable, why are they vulnerable, and trying to reduce that vulnerability. The second way to further urban adaptation justice is through multi-level governance itself. So how well does the local governance level work with the regional and with the national governance level? Are the concerns that are taking place at the local level being heard? Are they being implemented? Are they being respected at the regional and national levels? The third would be capacity enhancements. We heard the minister from Mauritius saying that this is a very new issue and local governments need help in their planning decisions, how to integrate climate change data into their decisions as to where to build things, public infrastructure, and also just technical know-how. And then the fourth would be justice criteria in urban planning. So when sort of new infrastructure is being built, how have local communities been involved in that process? This is a picture of Taksim Square. I'm not too sure. I'm just sure you're all aware of Istanbul's Senin, which was like a vote on what kind of development would be appropriate for 3 different squares in Istanbul. This is just a picture I took off the website. I thought it was quite a nice example of a way you can include local communities in urban planning. This is also just on a small side note why I'm here in Istanbul at the Istanbul Policy Center, because I'm taking these 4 criteria and seeing how Istanbul municipality is working in terms of climate change adaptation and to what degree these elements are adhered to, what's working well, what isn't working well. I think that's pretty much it. I have just some links. If you're interested more in the sort of political science theoretical foundations, I know my talk was quite practical, but if you're more interested in the theoretical foundations, I would recommend Ostrom, particularly on multi-level and polycentric governance. She and Nostrum are excellent papers on participation. I would recommend, as a climate researcher, I have to recommend the IPCC, particularly the chapter on impacts, adaptation and vulnerability. There'll be a new report coming out next year. It'll be really interesting to see what they say and how that is implemented by climate justice groups as well. There's the We Adapt, which is a big fundus on sort of techniques and skills that you can use to engage local communities in climate change adaptation. Going on right now until the 4th of December are the UNFCCC climate dialogues, which is really interesting to, they have a huge program of different speakers from all across the world on issues from climate science, but also to climate activism. And then there's also the Climate Adaptation Summit in January, which is led by the Global Center on Adaptation. And if you're interested in submitting things actually to present yourself, then you can until the beginning of January. Yeah, I hope I could sort of show how climate injustice manifests at the local level, that it really is those least responsible for climate change have the highest burden, and how difficult it is to include these people in the multi-level governance system. I hope that wasn't too long, and thank you very much.
Okay, thank you so much. Wow, that was very informative. Well, I was actually looking at the chat room if our audience wants to participate to the discussion or if there are any questions. But before I go to the floor, I would like to actually ask two questions. Maybe we can open up a debate. On one of the, well, this is not a question that, you know, directly addresses, you know, one of our panelists, but maybe a general question, right? Well, of course, after the US elections, we tend to link everything, every problem in the world to the US leadership, right? And this is something that we have been missing in the last 4 years, sorry, particularly during the Trump presidency. President Trump was not a great sort of volunteer or, you know, admirer of climate change related issues. And this is actually one of the, you know, things that his policy rollbacks and withdrawal from the 2015 agreement was actually very sad for us to see, right? So basically, that the US leadership during his term, you know, was absent in responding climate change. I think it slowed down international all sorts of efforts to reduce emissions, right? And now we have a completely new aspiration under the Biden leadership, and you know his policy proposals are dramatically different from Trump administration. So, you know, we hope that he'll use these, you know, upcoming 4 years to restore the environmental policies that President Trump just methodologically, you know, sort of frozen. So what would your take on this be like in terms of leadership on climate change? Are we at such a level, you know, in all these, you know, climate change related efforts at the global level, that do we still need a leadership to cope with all these, you know, crises? Or this is the first question. And my second question would be more on the local level. Well, David, you already, you know, gave us a very detailed account of efforts at the local level. I myself had written, I don't know, a couple of years ago on public opinion on climate change as a human security issue. And there, you know, looking at like systematic survey data, I had like analyzed sort of in a comparative fashion in European countries, in Turkey, in US, public attitudes towards climate change. And there have been like great variation in terms of like among the transatlantic publics in terms of, you know, knowledge about climate change, risk assessments, you know, perceived immediacy of risks, readiness for sort of trade-offs, you know, economy versus climate, so forth and so on. And I mean, I strongly believe that we don't only need an international leadership, but also this has to be at the local level. And first, we need to increase local awareness about the climate change. And we see like diverging patterns in different parts of the world. This is almost like a global north versus global south. We are still there, like as if we were there at, you know, 4 decades ago, right? So what would your take on these 2 points? I mean, global leadership and local initiatives, at least, you know, in different parts, in the developed part of the world. So yeah, I mean, I wouldn't ask this question and to, you know, each of you, just the floor is open for any debate if you have any contributions, if you would like to answer. Yeah, and while you were thinking, maybe there is Yara who asked, also, she just wrote her message here. Let me try to read it. Yara's question is this. I think this is about a politicizing of climate change causing leaders around the world to hold strong adversary, uneducated opinions. So this is, I think, more or less in line with what I just, you know, mentioned. In the case of Trump, who believed climate change and global warming are created by Chinese and claiming both are a hoax. So I think this is a great supplementary of what I tried to introduce. Yes, would you like to answer, or like, would you like to talk, or just simply say, oh, this is irrelevant, so forget about it?
May I just have a go? Maybe I could start the,
yes, please, go ahead.
Okay, great. Well, thank you for these points. I think these are great food for thought. Maybe coming to your first point, Ebru Canan, about the US leadership. I think it's quite crucial to talk about US leadership, and obviously the shift from Trump to Biden is a welcome one. But I think we shouldn't forget that before Trump, US was not really the harbinger of climate optimism, or it has never been the kind of the best practice or best example of leadership on climate change. So it's important to see that, for instance, the climate envoy pick of Biden, John Kerry, has been at the driver's seat all the way going up to the Paris Agreement. And obviously, both the Paris Agreement, which is a success on its own, and also the failure of the Copenhagen Accords, which is a massive failure, which still led Obama to get a Nobel Prize, are stuff to be questioned. I mean, I think it's important that we do not take the US leadership under Biden for granted. Obviously, there is a positive move, but I think Biden administration will need to move that. It's basically not going back to the old normal, but it's offering something new. I would say that that's my first take. About the issue about politicizing and kind of the polarization and so on and so forth. I think it's important to maybe frame the question in a way that, I mean, I wouldn't say that there is any unpolitical dimension to climate change. Climate change itself is political, whether we agree with that or not. It just depends where we look at it. So I think it's important to see that, for instance, China, with its unilateral pledge, is politicizing the climate debate. The issue is how do other states respond to that? So it's not necessarily dividing, I would say. I think the issue is to, again, connect climate change with other societal discussions. Because when we leave climate change on its own, obviously the split would be between climate deniers and climate supporters, and people who would like to take action, people who don't want to take action, and so on and so forth. But maybe the question needs to be asked differently.
And if I may just add something to that, to Yara's question, I think that this is the exact kind of politicization that I was talking about in my talk, which is about partisanship. And it's when, as Ethemcan explained really nicely, when climate movements and other climate actors are demanding change, they are demanding a kind of repoliticization, which is not about polarization, which is not about partisanship, but it's rather about connecting different. It's not about connecting, but it's about seeing how different issues connect and how these deep divisions actually affect how people engage with the issue of climate change and whether they're going to take action or not. So that's a different kind of politicization is needed. And that's why I would also agree, Ebru Hoca, to your question that leadership is necessary. It's definitely a positive change from Trump to Biden, but maybe somehow also in the sense that, any administration will fare better than Trump in relation to environmental issues and climate change. We should not, so I agree with Ethemcan, we should not expect really, any revolutionary change. And I think that the real transformation would not happen at the national level and the global policymaking level for the reasons that I explained before, but that we need to look at the alternative paths and at the local transnational links. Yeah.
Thank you.
If I can also add something, I mean,
sure.
just before we get to the local level, I thought the phrasing of Yara's question was interesting because she writes, in the case of Trump, who believed climate change and global warming are created by the change. So firstly, I would possibly contest that he actually believes that. I think there are many things he says he believes in, but actually no person in their right mind does, and he says it to make a political point. But the other question that drives climate scientists absolutely crazy is whether you believe in climate change, because it's like asking someone if they believe in gravity or they believe that the Earth is round. There is equally as much evidence for gravity existing as there is for climate change, and I find it interesting the way world leaders are are utilizing these understandable preconceptions that people have with climate change, because it completely questions their worldview, particularly of the older generation. They've sort of grown up with industrialization, you know, the fumes coming up from the car factories and the coal mines is a sign of work and wealth creation and a sign of progress. And climate change completely nullifies that. It says this, what you have been doing is terrible and you have ruined the lives of future generations. And this is difficult for people to come to terms with, I think. And it's, we need to understand how we can prevent world leaders of who it's not in their interest to do something about climate change, how we can prevent the public from being fooled by that. I think that would be some interesting research. Coming to the local level, it's a really great question. And so I was born and raised in Germany, from the outside sort of perceived as a very sort of a country where with a strong education system and many resources. And yet I can tell you that local people in both South Africa and Mauritius know a lot more about climate change than people in Germany. That's just because they're already dealing with the effects. They're dealing with the changes, they're living through them, they're experiencing them, which is very sad, but you don't have to explain what climate change is to anyone, let alone have to justify why it exists. The only question is how you can organize well at a local level so that it doesn't just have an effect in that one locality, but also has effect in other places, how you can scale up. So I think these sort of climate justice movements are great. There are some things to criticize about them, but on the whole, it's going to be really interesting how these next few years shape out.
Well, thank you very much. I just realized that we have one question is one and a comment from Yasemin Hoca, but let me start with the question. This is a question that is asked directly to Ethemcan. What strategy does climate justice movement have to connect to local grassroots struggles? And Yasemin's comment is, I strongly agree with that, the language, simplification of the language, to make the ordinary man on the street be concerned, be aware of climate change, that it's a security issue, it's an issue for everyone, not for just some specific parts of the global community. So yes, Ethemcan, maybe would you like to answer the question?
Yes, well, thanks, Dobroslava, for this question. I think it's extremely important about the strategy to connect global movements with the local grassroots struggles. Unfortunately, I don't have an answer to that. I hope someone has an answer, a clear-cut answer to that. But I have my own ideas in terms of, not really a strategy, but a couple of ideas in terms of how this could be achieved in the best way possible. And I would say that it's probably through an humble vision, a humble view of the local grassroots struggles for what they are and for what they're not, by the very resource-rich global institutionalized NGOs, as well as global justice movements who may have support of one sort or another. So I think it's about learning from the grassroots it's about amplifying the concerns and voices of the grassroots when you have the ability and the possibility to do so. It's really important that we have these umbrella groups. So we used to have CAN, Climate Action Climate Action Network, which split with CJN, Climate Justice Now movement, which later transmorphed into what is now Demand Climate Justice Coalition. So basically we have these coalitions which are not necessarily binding huge institutions, but they rather act as a funnel to kind of gather and collect the local grievances and arguments and comments and kind of amplify those at the global institutional setting. So I think this is extremely important. So probably the strategy of connection should be through this two-way connection, both the local looking up to kind of amplify its message and kind of learn from the global processes, but also the global movement being humble about what it is and what it is not, and really kind of learning, amplifying, and kind of transmitting the knowledge and experiences of the local level.
Thank you very much, Ethemcan. Yes. Any comments on the language, like the ways to communicate?
Well, this is obviously very important, and I think this is also part of repoliticizing the issue, because, you know, not treating it just as a matter of science and technology, sort of as an expert issue, but as something that concerns everybody and in their daily lives. Like David said, in Mauritius, everybody knows about it because they experience it continuously. And I think this is being reconsidered, especially by the movements and by, for instance, the arts and culture communities, which are engaging with the question of, you know, climate change, but also in a way that can touch people more directly, and that can make this huge abstract and technical scientific issue into a daily concern for everybody. So there are lots of big initiatives being taken in that direction. So I think it's already recognized that there's this disconnection, and a lot of people are now engaging with that problem. So, and it goes back to what David said about reimagining progress, because, you know, it's no longer signs of development to see thermic power plants or coal mines, or, you know, in the case of Turkey, large dams. These are not necessarily signs of progress, but they remind us about our ecological failure. So it is necessary to rethink that and to have a new sociological imagination about it. Yeah.
Thank you very much, Hande. I think we have come to the end of our time. Well, that was a great panel, I must say. Thank you very much, everybody. Thank you very much also to the audience. We received very interesting questions and comments, very important ones. So, well, thanks everyone for attention. But before we leave, we'd like to thank our panelists with a small but a special donation. I think the Tema Foundation, we started this ritual this semester. Well, we've talked a lot about the climate change and climate crisis, and I think this time Tema found that our donation will be much more meaningful. Well, we all know about Tema, Turkish Foundation for Combating Soil Erosion, for Reforestation and the Protection of Natural Habitats. well, I hope that our donation will at least contribute to a better world, and please accept our small gift to to you for your participation to our webinar. And I would like to give my thanks to on behalf of everyone. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Next time we would like, well, in safer days, in healthier days, we would like to meet in person as well. So this time, just through this digital technologies. Thank you a lot, and I hope to see everyone very soon in good health and good shape. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Bye bye.
Thank you.
Take
Bye-bye.
care, everyone.
Bye.